All right, so tonight we're going to be in Luke chapter 6. Now you can see I have put all three passages down where this tonight's miracle is located in the scripture. And we're not going to take the time to read all three passages because I'm going to tell you, when I got ready to start working on this particular miracle, I realized very quickly there was one of two ways I could go. I could either go super short and give you just the surface level, or we could go a little bit deeper and me take the chance of not getting it all done tonight. So those are my two options. So I chose the more detailed option. I don't really want to be just surface level in our Bible study. So for tonight, we're going to do that. So I'm gonna not take the time to read all three passages in detail. We're going to focus on Luke 6. I will refer and I will read some of the verses from the other passages as we go through this. But this is where we are tonight. So tonight, as we continue looking at the miracles of Jesus, we come to this next miracle, which again, it stands apart just a little bit from many of his other miracles. All the miracles, as we've seen, they all have a purpose to them. Sometimes they have more than one purpose. In this particular instance, we find another miracle taking place on the Sabbath. And in this miracle, the Lord is again going to use this opportunity to emphasize the fact that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath doesn't control him. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. And in fact, this miracle that we're going to look at, it is actually one of only three miracles that actually take place in a Jewish synagogue. And so I think that's interesting. We have all these miracles that Jesus did, and only three of them actually happen in a synagogue. And as I said, we're going to be primarily in Luke 6, but we will refer to the passages found in Matthew and Mark as well. But to get us started, I want to begin by looking at the background of the miracle. Before we can get into the full detail of the miracle, we need to understand what's taking place before it. Let's go ahead and let's read the miracle through once, and then we'll get into the full background here. Luke chapter 6, verse 6. Now it happened on another Sabbath also that he entered the synagogue and taught. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. But he knew their thoughts and said to the man who had the withered hand, "Arise and stand here." And he arose and stood. Then Jesus said to them, "I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy?" And when he had looked around at them all, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so. And his hand was restored as whole as the other. But they were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. All right, so let's remember for a moment, as we talk about the background here, let's remember the last miracle we saw Jesus performing was the healing of the paralytic at the pool of Bethesda, right? And that took place on the Sabbath day. If you remember, Jesus was seemingly alone in Jerusalem for one of the feast days when he performed that miracle. And that miracle, you remember, it stirred up quite the controversy because he healed on the Sabbath and told this man to get up and carry his bed on the Sabbath. Well, sometime after that miracle, we find that he has returned to Galilee, and we see the immediate context of our miracle, which is this. It began with another Sabbath controversy. That's what the beginning of this miracle is. It's another Sabbath controversy. If we were to take the time to go back and read verses 1 through 5, we would find that Jesus and his followers were traveling. And in their travels, they got hungry. And as they were traveling, that hunger grew, and they came across some grain fields. And so while they're traveling, they find these grain fields. They decide to pluck a few heads of grain, and they ate them. And of course, some of the Pharisees saw this, and when they saw this, they accused them of breaking the law by plucking this grain on the Sabbath. Now understand, it's important to remember that the law that these Pharisees so loved to hold dear, the law actually made provision for the hungry to pluck a few heads of grain when traveling. So their issue isn't that they're stealing. They're not stealing. The law made it perfectly clear. If you were traveling, you're hungry, you come across a field, it's okay to take just a little bit that you need. But the Pharisees had gone further than that. They had added to the law, and they said that if you plucked grain for any reason, it didn't matter what the reason was, if you plucked grain on the Sabbath, then you were breaking the Sabbath. You were breaking the law. So Jesus, in this moment, while they were traveling, he proceeded to school the Pharisees by pointing out that even King David, when he was hungry, went into the house of God and took the showbread. And if you remember, the showbread was only for the priests. And yet King David went in there and took the showbread when they were hungry. And so this event that took place in the grain fields, this was just the beginning of the Sabbath controversy up in Galilee. Because it wasn't long before here came another Sabbath. And on this Sabbath that we read about in verses 6 through 11, we find the next part of the background, and that is that Jesus was teaching in the temple. Again, in a typical synagogue service, after the prayers were said, a scripture would be read, and someone would get up and they would explain the scripture that had been read. There was no single person responsible for this. There was no one individual. Instead, usually there would be a rabbi or a distinguished visitor that would be invited to deliver the message. But after the message, there would be a time of discussion and argument. I can just imagine what our church services would be like if after my sermons on Sunday morning, I said, okay, now let's open everything up for discussion. Who wants to argue with what I just said? That would be that would be a different kind of church service, wouldn't it? But that's basically what happened. They would get up and they would have a time of discussion and argument. And that is the point of the service that it seems this miracle likely took place in. So we see the background of the miracle. Let's look at the man who is the recipient of this miracle. I want you to look with me again, Luke 6, verse 6. Notice what it says. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. All right, now there are a few things for us to see about this man and his condition. First of all, I want you to see that this man's hand was completely useless. We're told that his hand was withered. When it uses that term withered, it's literally talking about that it, whether through paralysis or injury, it had become unusable. And because it was unusable, if you see someone who has a leg or hand that they cannot use, it usually begins to shrivel up, right? It shrivels up because you're not using the muscles. It gets weakened and it kind of atrophies. That is the condition of his hand. That's what it means by this withered. And so because his hand had withered and shriveled up, it served as a serious handicap. He can do absolutely nothing with this hand. It is unusable. Not only is his hand completely useless, secondly, we see that the man's livelihood was affected. His livelihood was affected. Notice, which hand is it that is messed up? It's his right hand, right? In fact, Luke is the only gospel writer to tell us that it's his right hand. Why would Luke do that? Remember, Luke is the doctor. Luke is the one who pays attention to these little tiny details and sees some things that other people don't fully notice or think are significant. Why does it matter that it's his right hand? Well, the vast majority of people are what? Right-handed. Okay? For most people, their right hand is their dominant hand. But in Jewish culture, it also had another element to it. The right hand was considered the clean hand. and the left hand was considered unclean. I've been to some countries and heard of some countries where if you go there and you try to shake someone's hand with your right hand, they get offended because as far as they're concerned, the right hand is the dirty hand and the left hand is the clean hand. And so understand, as far as their culture is concerned, his hand that is withered, that's the good hand, that's the clean hand, and all he has is this dirty, unclean hand. And understand that the reason it was considered unclean is because we're talking about when people go to use the restroom. Let me put it simply that way, okay? So, the fact that it is his right hand, that would have only compounded his problem. The fact that he had a hand he could not use, it's his dominant hand. It's a bad time. It's worse that it's his dominant hand, and it would have affected his whole way of life, and it would have affected even how others treated him. But remember, the greater the problem, the greater the opportunity for Jesus to show his power. So this man's hand was completely useless. His livelihood was affected. Thirdly, I want you to see something important about this man. That is that this man was in the right place in spite of his condition. He's in the right place. Again, where is this man in the story? He's in the synagogue, right? He is in the synagogue to attend the services. In spite of this withered hand, which I imagine was probably a source of embarrassment for him, he still went to the synagogue service. You know, it's interesting. We live in a day and time, unfortunately, when many people let the simplest, smallest thing keep them from being in the place of worship. Now, am I saying that if somebody has a super contagious, really dangerous disease that they should come on ahead and show up to church anyway and just spread it to everybody? No, of course not, right? But we also shouldn't use every single little physical problem we have as an excuse for not going to the house of worship. And unfortunately, that's a place we've come to in our society where many Christians, if they get a sniffle, okay, I'm staying home. And that's unfortunate. Think about it. What would actually be accomplished for the Lord if every single person chose not to come to the house of worship because of their physical problems and handicaps? Let's be real honest. I think everyone in this room, we all have some physical handicaps and problems from time to time, right? If we let that stop us every single time, would we ever have anyone in church? No, and that's the point here, okay? We wouldn't have any service for God. But by being here for this man, by being in his place, in the worship service, at the synagogue, this man was in a place where he could receive a blessing. Just imagine if he had not shown up to the synagogue that day. If he hadn't shown up, he wouldn't have received his blessing, would he? I often wonder, how many blessings do God's people miss because they miss public times of worship? That is something each of us should consider the next time we're tempted to skip a service for some, we'll call it for a not so important reason. How about that? Maybe it's something we should consider. Maybe before we decide to skip, we should say, what blessing am I possibly going to miss today? And it might challenge us to think, is this problem really worth missing the blessing? Now, again, let me just say, if you've got a serious condition, something serious going on, I'm not saying you need to, I get it. All right, we see the man in the miracle. Let's also notice next the opposition to the miracle. So here's a man, he's got a great need, but there's some opposition to this miracle. In spite of the good that this miracle healing would provide, we find in our verses that there was a lot of opposition to this miracle. The first piece of opposition is this. The scribes and Pharisees tried to hinder the miracle. Look with me at verse 7. Luke 6, verse 7. So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. So we immediately see in this verse that the opposition is led by none other than the scribes and the Pharisees, as usual. These men, throughout Jesus' ministry, displayed an amazing determination to oppose Jesus and his ministry. Why? Why were they so opposed to him? Why were they so opposed to the work Jesus was doing? It's because Jesus exposed their hypocrisy. In everything Jesus did and everything he said, he exposed them as frauds. He damaged their reputation. He damaged their influence among the people. And so for them, he was public enemy number one. And on this occasion, their opposition was very deliberate. How did they oppose him? First of all, notice they watched every move Jesus made. Notice it says they watched him. The word watched is translated from a word that we would use to say that they spied on him. If you want to look at it, that's basically what this verse is saying is that they spied on Jesus. They're there in the service and they're all pretending to focus on what's going on in the service. But in reality, they're watching Jesus out of the corner of their eye. They're not watching for good reasons. They're watching for bad reasons. They want to see, what is he going to do? We want to make sure we're watching the moment Jesus does something. And so they spied on him. And that word watched, it's in the imperfect tense, which means that it was a continuous action. From start to finish, from the moment synagogue started to the moment it finished, they just kept on watching him. They were watching him out of the corner of their eye, looking to see what move he might make. They're like private investigators. They watched his every movement, just hoping they could catch him in the act of doing something wrong. They hated him, and they needed to find something they could use to stop him and stop his ministry. But not only did these men watch him, I want you to notice they went a step further. They questioned Jesus. Now for this, we turn over and we look and we see this in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 10. Matthew 12:10, and they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Matthew is the only gospel that reports these Pharisees and scribes questioning Jesus. And the issue at hand is about a man's behavior on the Sabbath. What is a man allowed or not allowed to do on the Sabbath? And listen, that is an important topic to the Pharisees and scribes. It is more important to them what a person does or does not do on the Sabbath than anything else. Over and over, this is the major point of contention between Jesus and the religious leaders, is what can you and can you not do on the Sabbath? In all three accounts, this miracle is preceded in the text by an incident in which the enemies of Jesus were already arguing with him about the Sabbath. And so this argument in the synagogue, this questioning, is really just an extension of an ongoing argument between them and Jesus. And let's remember, the religious leaders, they had created a lot of laws and regulations concerning the Sabbath. These were rules that God had never intended to be a part of the Sabbath. And so Christ, in his ministry, he purposely ignored these man-made laws. He knew exactly which laws were from God and which were man-made. And he said, I don't care about your man-made laws. I care about God's law because I'm God. And so I am the one who is Lord over the Sabbath. And so he ignored it. And on this occasion, the behavior that they are questioning, what they are trying to determine, is it right or wrong, evil or good, is can you heal on the Sabbath? The rabbis, understand, one commentator shared this, the rabbis didn't allow any medical treatments on the Sabbath day. The only way you were allowed for some rabbis to have medical treatments was if delaying the treatment would endanger someone's life. That's pretty bad. But that's not as bad as the strictest school of thought. Rabbi Shammai actually had the strictest school of thought. He forbade even the comforting of the sick on the Sabbath. So you know someone who's sick, you can't even go and offer comfort to them on the Sabbath. That's pretty strict, wouldn't you say? And so understand, this is the frame of mind these scribes and Pharisees are coming from. Their laws are all about outward conformity to the rules instead of an inward heart condition. Their laws were so restrictive that to actually heal a person on the Sabbath would break their laws. Let's be very clear. That was never God's intention with the Sabbath day. God, when he created the Sabbath day, didn't sit there and think, you know what? I'm going to create this day and they better not heal anybody on the Sabbath. I don't want people getting better on the Sabbath. I don't want people getting suddenly healthy and whole on the Sabbath. That wasn't God's intention. The whole purpose of the Sabbath was for rest and worship. But this question that they asked, you know, what it really revealed is it revealed their lack of compassion for their fellow man. It showed that for the Pharisees and scribes, their priorities were all mixed up. The question, it highlights the fact that as followers of the law, they actually promoted evil and hindered good works. You see, by asking this question, they're basically telling Jesus, if you heal someone today, you are breaking the law. You better not heal someone. You know it's against the law to heal someone. How spiritually and morally sick does the heart of a person need to be to support a law that says it's illegal to heal someone? Can you imagine? That's the problem. So they questioned Jesus. Now, the third part of their opposition here is that their motivation was to accuse Jesus of evil. Again, in Matthew 12:10, it says, and they asked him that they might accuse him. In our passage in Luke 6:7, it says that they might find an accusation. They watched him, that they might find an accusation against him. The reason they were watching him, the reason they were questioning him, was so that they could find something they could use to accuse Jesus of evil. That word translated find in Luke chapter 6, verse 7, it emphasized an earnestness in what they were doing. In the context, it means to search for something. And search is exactly what they did. They were searching like someone with a fine-tooth comb to try to find any accusation they could use against Jesus. They weren't looking for the good things he did. They were looking for anything they could call evil. And what did they want to do if they found something? Matthew says they wanted to accuse him. It is a very specific and distinct word that means to accuse someone formally, as in before a tribunal. In other words, they're not just wanting to watch him. They're not looking for him to do something just so they can accuse him right there in front of the synagogue. No, they're looking for an accusation that they can bring in legal terms and bring him before a tribunal and put him on trial for what he's done. That's what they are looking for when it uses this word accuse. They want to prosecute him. And of course, what punishment were they seeking if they could get him in front of a court? Well, as we saw last week, and as we'll continue to see, they're seeking his death. Nothing but his death will accomplish their goals. So, the scribes and the Pharisees, they were trying everything they could to hinder this miracle and to hinder the work of Jesus. But the next point we see here is that Jesus was fully aware of their attempts to hinder. Notice again in Luke 6, verse 8, it says, but he knew their thoughts. Before they ever began asking questions, he knew their thoughts. Jesus wasn't caught off guard by any of this. Before they even acted against him to try to hinder his work, he knew their thoughts. He knew their animosity towards him. And that is one of the evidences of his deity. The fact that he is aware of our thoughts, that should have an impact on how we live our lives. Whether anyone else knows our inner thoughts or not, God knows them. We can't hide anything from God, not even our thoughts. And that should be enough to inspire us to live holy lives. These wicked, evil men, they had no clue that Jesus knew exactly what they were thinking. So he was fully aware of what they were trying to do. Now let's look at Jesus' response to the opposition. Notice, first of all, that Jesus exposed the evil of their laws and regulations. Look at me at Luke 6, verse 9. Then Jesus said to them, I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy? Let's put this question in a little bit simpler way. He's like, hey, I got one question for you guys. What are we supposed to do on the Sabbath? Are we supposed to do good works or bad works? Are we supposed to help people? Are we supposed to save lives or destroy lives? What are we supposed to do here on the Sabbath? Jesus' question was a perfect way to expose the evil of their laws and regulations they had created. These weren't God's laws. They thought they could trap Jesus with a question, and he turned the tables on them by asking his own question. And it was a question they couldn't answer. Because if they had answered Jesus' question, they would have been embarrassed. Because the answer is obvious. What is the purpose of the Sabbath? What should be done on the Sabbath? Good works or bad works? What should be done? Good works, right? What is more important, saving a life or destroying a life? The answer is obvious. So they can't answer him because the Sabbath is for doing good and saving life. It's not for evil. It's not for destroying. It's not for causing harm. And so just by this simple question, he exposes the evil nature of their law, the fact that their law is wrong. Secondly, he exposed their hypocrisy. Now again, back over in Matthew chapter 12, verses 11 and 12, we get a little bit more information here. Matthew 12:11 says, Then he said to them, What man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Listen, Jesus put it all out there for everyone to hear. And he shows just how hypocritical these Pharisees are. And he basically says, listen, if any one of you guys had a sheep and that sheep needed rescuing on the Sabbath, every one of you knows you would go rescue that sheep. You would do whatever you had to do to save that sheep. Because as far as you're concerned, the sheep are too valuable for you to not even save it on the Sabbath. And he turns that and he says, if a sheep is valuable enough to be saved and to do good towards that sheep on the Sabbath, how much more valuable is a man? Implied in this is that healing this living, breathing man who is suffering from this withered hand is of much greater importance and of much more value than rescuing a sheep from a pit on the Sabbath. So if they would save a sheep, why are they so against healing a man? Is the man that worthless? So he exposes their hypocrisy. Thirdly, Jesus silenced his opposition. I love Mark chapter 3, verse 4. We read this. After this statement, after he responds to them, Mark 3:4 says, but they kept silent. He questions them. He says, hey, what about all this? And His answer to their question, it stunned and silenced the scribes and Pharisees. Again, that phrase, kept silent, is in the imperfect tense again, meaning they didn't just have a moment of silence, they kept on being quiet. They kept their mouths shut. Nobody said a word. It was a painful, embarrassing silence for them. But the silence of these men led to something else, something a little unexpected, something we don't quite expect from Jesus, and that is this. Jesus was angered by their hard hearts. He asked them a simple question. What is right to do on the Sabbath, good or evil? What is right to do, to save a life or to destroy a life? And they respond to him in silence. They don't want to answer him. They don't want to give the answer that everyone knows is the right answer. And that angered him. Mark chapter 3, verse 5. Again, verse 4 said, but they kept silent. Verse 5, and when he had looked around at them with anger, being grieved by the hardness of their hearts. Mark is the only gospel writer who tells us about the Lord's anger in this incident. Jesus was upset with these men because they had a serious heart problem. They had a hardness in their heart. And that hardness had caused them to be insensitive, to not even be able to recognize what's right and what's wrong in God's sight. They were insensitive to the needs of men. They had no compassion for the needy. As far as they were concerned, this man with the withered hand could just go on ahead and suffer another day. That was their opinion because it was the Sabbath. That's what sin does in our lives. It hardens the heart. It makes people cruel, and it turns people away from God's truth. So we see the opposition to the miracle. Let's now look at the healing in the miracle. The healing in the miracle. And the first thing I want to show you here is as he goes to heal this man, understand that one thing we can glean from the scriptures is that Jesus was committed to healing this man. It didn't matter what opposition Jesus faced. He wasn't going to let them stop him from healing this man. Nothing they said, nothing they did was going to stop him. It didn't matter to him if the whole synagogue was against and opposed to him healing this man. He was committed to healing him. Listen, as Christians, we cannot let opposition stop us from doing what is right in God's sight. No matter what others say, we must press forward in God's service. He was committed to healing the man. Secondly, we see that Jesus commands the healing. In this miracle, we see the example of another miracle that is being worked merely through the words and the commands of Jesus. There's no action here. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't touch him. He doesn't do any miraculous touch of some kind. It's all through his command and his word. Luke's account shows us that Jesus issued two commands. The first command comes before Jesus begins to answer his critics and his opposition. The first command is a command to stand. Notice what the scripture says. It says, arise. He tells him to arise and stand here. Now, why did Jesus command this man to come and to stand in the middle with him? Did he really need this man to come stand in front of everybody for this healing to take place? Couldn't he have healed him where he was just sitting, wherever he was? Sure, he could have, but there was a purpose here. Understand that this purpose of the command to stand, it served as a moment of confession for this man. By standing in the middle of the synagogue, this man with the withered hand acknowledged that he is a man with a need. Listen, if you don't confess you're sick, can the doctor help you? If you don't tell the doctor what's wrong, can they help fix you? No. It took humility for this man to stand up and be recognized as someone with a need. a need that he could not fix himself. But understand this opportunity to stand, this command to stand, it served as an opportunity to test the compassion of the scribes and Pharisees. With this man now standing in front of them with his withered hand, it was an opportunity to see if their hearts could be pricked by the tenderness of the moment. Could they look at this man and feel any tenderness or compassion towards him as he now stands before them? Instead, all we see from them is animosity, and the healing itself reveals their lack of compassion. But understand, this command to stand also provided a confirmation for the miracle. By making this man with a withered hand visible for all to see, it would be impossible for anyone to deny that this miracle had taken place and that Jesus had commanded it to happen. They could see it take place with their own eyes. And so he made the command to stand. But then after he speaks to the opposition, after he's challenged them, he sees the hardness of his heart and he issues a command to stretch. Notice he says, stretch out your hand. Now here we see the test of faith. Like the commands from some of the earlier miracles, this command would have been impossible for this man to perform because of the withered condition of his hand. It's a hand he hasn't used and we don't know how long, but it's withered, it's atrophied, it's not usable. The muscles aren't working. And it's important to notice Jesus doesn't say stretch out your arm. It wasn't the arm that was withered, was it? He says stretch out your hand. Something this man could not fathom that he could do himself. But with God's command comes God's power. And faith will always seek to obey the command. Faith will always seek to obey and believe that God will provide the strength. Faith will obey the command even when the command seems impossible to do. This man would have to exercise faith and obedience if he was going to be healed. And so then we see that the man obeyed Jesus' commands. Notice how he obeyed. First, he obeyed completely. He obeyed completely. When Jesus told him to arise and stand here, what did he do? He arose and stood, right? When Jesus told him, stretch out your hand, what did he do? Luke says, and he did so. Mark says he stretched it out. Everything, everything the Lord told him to do, he did. The commands were humbling, but he still obeyed them completely. The commands were hard, especially the last one, but he still obeyed. See, obedience isn't based on whether the command is easy or hard. It's based on the one who gives the command. If God gives the command, we must obey. Easy or hard doesn't matter. We obey completely. Not only did he obey completely, but he obeyed continuously. Notice the man obeyed the first command, and then later, when the second command was given, he obeyed it too. Continuous obedience is necessary to obtain the blessings. What if this man had only obeyed the first command? What if when Jesus said, arise and stand, he obeyed that, but when Jesus said, stretch out your hand, he said, no, I don't think I will. Jesus, you know I can't do that. Would he have received God's blessing? No. Would he have received the healing? No. In order to receive the blessing, he had to continue in obedience. A lot of folks start out serving Jesus, but they soon find themselves in a place of disobedience. And then they wonder why they aren't the recipients of God's blessings anymore. Listen, let me put it in one simple way. If we don't keep running the race, we'll never win the race, will we? You can't win the race if you don't keep running. We want to get the prize. We have to keep obeying God. Keep obeying, keep obeying, keep obeying. Now, we see the man obeyed Jesus' commands. Fourthly, the man was fully restored. He was fully restored. Notice verse 10, Luke 6:10, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. By comparing his right hand to his left hand, it helps us to see the completeness of the healing. It's showing us, hey, as whole as his left hand was, his right hand is completely the same. Jesus doesn't do anything halfway. He did a complete job. And this man's total healing demonstrated the greatness of Jesus' power. He is truly omnipotent, and he can overcome any problem, no matter how difficult it may seem. But with the miracle now done, we see the hatred that comes after the miracle. We see the hatred after the miracle. Notice with me verse 11. But they were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Let me share a few simple thoughts about their reaction to what Jesus did. First of all, they were passionate in their hatred. They were passionate in their hatred. Notice it says they were filled with rage. This hatred wasn't just some passing feeling. It filled them. It consumed them. They should have been filled with a love for God, right? That's what should have filled their hearts. Instead, their entire being was set against God's holy Son. And what were they filled with? They were filled with rage. Some translations use the word madness. I believe the King James uses the word folly, if I'm not mistaken. The Greek word literally means, the King James word, it means folly. And it describes a rage that is similar to insanity. In other words, there is a folly and a rage that it's going insane is what it's really doing. It's having this frame of mind and not having any understanding of what you're doing or why you're doing it. You're just doing it. This word is only used 2 times in the New Testament. And both times it implies a senseless rage. It implies this action, this hatred, this action that has no justification. So in other words, these men, they were foolishly upset and angry, and there was no justification for what they do next. Don't forget, why is it folly what they're doing? Why is it foolish and unjustified, their anger? Because let me ask you, did Jesus actually do any work on the Sabbath? What did he do? He spoke a few words, right? Is it now against the law to speak words of healing on the Sabbath? You see, he didn't actually commit an actual work. All he did was speak, and the healing took place. He healed with his words. He hadn't actually broken any of their Sabbath rules. And yet they foolishly raged against him for it anyway. Listen, they were passionate in their hatred of Jesus. Secondly, they plotted with each other because of their hatred. Matthew 12, verse 14 says, Then the Pharisees went out and plotted against him, how they might destroy him. As soon as the synagogue service is over, the enemies of Christ left and started talking with each other about how they could stop him. And notice who they turned to. People of the same mindset. And let me just do a little sidebar here. How many churches have been torn apart because someone gets upset over something in the church, and next thing you know, that as soon as the church service is over, they've gone out and they've found people of the same frame of mind, and what are they doing? They're seeking out how can we tear this thing down? How can we destroy? How can we get rid of the preacher? You saw what he did. You heard what he did. How many churches have been destroyed because of that? They turned to people of the same mindset. They didn't try to convince the masses yet. They went and conspired with their little group about how they could bring down Jesus. But they didn't just want to bring him down. No, Scripture says they wanted to destroy him. They were looking to kill him. So not only were the folks in his hometown of Nazareth already ready to kill him, remember they wanted to shove him off the side of a cliff. Not only are the religious leaders in Jerusalem seeking to kill him because he healed the paralytic on the Sabbath. Now he has the religious elite in Galilee looking for ways to destroy and to kill him. It's interesting. They thought that it was illegal for Jesus to heal on the Sabbath, but they sure didn't seem to have any problem plotting a murder on the Sabbath. Can't heal on the Sabbath, but boy, can we plot a murder. How can we destroy this man? So they plotted. Thirdly, they joined hands with evil men. Mark chapter 3, verse 6 gives us an interesting detail. It says, then the Pharisees went out and immediately plotted, not just with themselves, they plotted with someone else. It says they immediately plotted with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him. See, they didn't stop their schemes with just plotting with each other. They did the unthinkable. They joined hands with the Herodians. Who are the Herodians? Listen, this was the group of Jews who were Herod's strongest supporters. Listen, there was no greater evidence of their hatred than the fact that they joined up with the Herodians. They conspired with the followers and supporters of Herod Antipas, who is the one that beheaded John the Baptist. It was his father who had ordered the children in Bethlehem to be killed. And this is who they turned to for help, to figure out how we can get rid of Jesus. Listen, when you join hands with people who are the enemy of Christ, you are not honoring Christ. You dishonor him. So we as Christians, we need to be careful. Who are we joining hands with? Are we joining hands with people who are actually the enemy of Christ? Let's be careful of that. All right, so we see this healing, and we're done with this miracle. And next week, we're going to push forward, and we'll look at Jesus healing the centurion's servant. All right.